So one thing that I see a whole lot of these days as I scroll through social media is people on the left yelling at each other. I see this a lot. And one of my biggest pet peeves is when I see someone like Pierce Morgan who has a panel and he'll have two influencers from the right and he'll have two influencers from the left. And they're all sitting there and they'll manage to get the two influencers on the left screaming at one another. And then Pierce and the other two right wingers sit back and laugh and go, yeah, you guys can't get it together. And I really feel like that's well manufactured. I feel like that's exactly what MAGA wants us to do. And I feel like that's exactly why we should stop playing into their hand. Those of us that believe in democracy, those of us that believe in women's rights, those of us that believe that marginalized groups should be lifted up, those of us that believes that Americans should have a fair hand to play in this world and that billionaires shouldn't control every aspect of our lives, we need to stick together. And when I say stick together, I don't mean that we have to agree on every single issue, because we're never going to. That's what separates us from them. We're never going to always agree on the same thing. We're not always going to get behind the same candidate. We're not always going to get behind the same idea. There will always be that one single issue that we disagree on, and we disagree on very strongly. But when we start yelling at one another because of that, and we start cutting each other down, all that does is play right into the hand of MAGA. And all that does is destroy everything that we've set out to accomplish. So I think it's very important that we all keep our eye on the ball going forward. And we all pay close attention to what's happening. And we pay close attention to the division that the right is trying so desperately to sow. Because the more division they sow, the more chaos they can create. And if they've got us in chaos, they're going to continue to win. Now, on the campaign trail, Kamala said something to the nature of, when we vote, we win. When we show up, we win. That became a catchphrase, but it's also very true. We show up, and when we show up, we win every time. But when we don't show up, we end up in the boat that we're in today. Now, if you've sat back and you've criticized the Biden administration so hard and so heavily and turned people against the Biden administration, then you can't necessarily sit here and complain to me and say, oh, I can't believe people didn't show up to vote. I can't believe people didn't show up. Well, they didn't show up because they lost faith. And they lost faith because they saw people on their side telling them that their own leaders wasn't worth a damn. So you can't have it both ways. You can't sit and say, oh, and heavily criticize somebody so hard that you turn people away from them and then say, why didn't people show up to vote? I'm not saying that we need to be cultish like Trump supporters. That's not what I mean by this. But Trump supporters, they get behind Trump regardless because they share the same common interest. Well, their same common interest is hatred and bigotry and bullying and just being shitty human beings. Our common interest is democracy and women's rights and people being lifted up and people being treated fairly and equality for all. That's what we stand for. We want to see people have health care. Those are our common interests. So if we sit and we demonize our side and spend all of our time talking about how bad our side has it, all that does is play into their hands to go, see, even they can't get it together. Even they see through the bullshit. And it inspires a whole lot of people on our side to look at it and go, well, we can't get it together. I turned on Piers Morgan and we got these two guys that I thought was on my side. They're all arguing at each other and they're all laughing at us. And hell, it don't matter. I'm just going to stay home today. So I feel like it's very important that we all encourage one another in the independent media circle. And we all try to lift each other up, and we don't try to cut each other down, and we don't try to encourage other people from following certain people. And we also don't try to cut people down and say that they're spreading misinformation and they're lying about things simply because we don't agree with it. Because when we do those things, all we do is sow division on our side. And when our side becomes divided, we lose every time. And I'm not going to go back here and Monday morning quarterback the last 8 years, but I could easily go back to 2016 and I could count all the conversations that I had with the Bernie bros who were so mad that Bernie wasn't the nominee. Yeah, but what's your common interest here? What do we all want out of this? Is Hillary our first choice? No, she's not. She wasn't mine either. But listen, if Donald Trump gets in, he's going to stack the Supreme Court. We can't let that happen. 4 years later, I had people messaging me going, damn, I didn't realize that could happen that way. I'm gonna have. I had one guy say to me, a friend of mine said, "Brandon, I'm gonna have to eat a big plate of crow on this one." You were right. When we stayed home, we lost. When we voted for third parties, we lost. That's not saying the Democratic establishment is perfect. That's not saying that everyone should believe everything they say. There are plenty of flaws in the Democratic establishment, and we can absolutely work to fix those problems. But we can't work to fix those problems if we're divided, and we can't work to fix those problems when we have a Republican president with the Supreme Court in his back pocket and the Senate and the House. And we lose those things because we decide to divide up into these camps and throw stones at each other. And then we look around one day and it's too little, too late. We can't rein it back in. And then we wonder why we lost. And we wonder why people didn't show up. People will show up for a united group of people because they see the strength in that, even if it's wrong, even if it's total bullshit. People will still back that and get behind that more than they will undecisiveness. It's just the truth. I know that's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow because it's so easy to look over at the Charlie Kirks of the world. And I sit here on the channel and did it the entire time, pointing out just how racist that dude is and just what bullshit he's spewing to young Americans. I pointed it out, made countless videos on that subject. But the guy went out there and he rallied his troops and he got them all united and he got them all to stand together, and they were all dead wrong. Meanwhile, again, we stand on the side of truth, we stand on the side of democracy, and we stand on the side of the issues that are going to matter and affect day-to-day Americans in their everyday lives. And we can't come together. We can't put those few differences aside to come together and say, hey, we're going for the greater good here. We may not agree on everything. We may not agree with Kamala Harris on this issue or that issue, but we do agree that Donald Trump is not going to make any of those issues better. I've made this point so many times, and I'll continue to make it. I'll be repetitive. I don't care. Whatever your one single issue was with Kamala Harris or Joe Biden, and that's the reason why you stayed home, or that's the reason why you wrote somebody in as a protest vote, you voted for Donald Trump when you did that. And Donald Trump was not going to make that issue any better. If anything, he was only going to make it worse. So now you've got everything that you didn't want, and we're still over here yelling at each other. And I don't believe in that. And something else, there are influencers out there on the left that aren't my cup of tea. And I'm sure that I'm not someone's cup of tea. But you're not going to hear me sit here and tell people to not follow somebody or try to cut somebody down. If I know that at the end of the day, we share the same common interest. Now, everybody knows that I'm a huge Adam Mockler fan. I talk about him all the time here on the channel. Everyone knows I name drop Luke Beasley all the time because I love those two guys. And the reason why is because they're young and they've got a lot of passion for what they do, and they're good at what they do, and they have the ability to reach the younger audience that I probably couldn't reach. So I'm sitting back here cheering them on. But if I were to hear Luke Beasley or Adam Mockler say something I disagreed with, I'm not going to start putting their names in the titles of my video. Adam Mockler gets it wrong. This is some shit. This kid don't know jack shit. I'm not going to do that, even if I find something I disagree with him on. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to bring him on the show and talk about it. Or I'm going to text him privately and say, hey, what about this? Let's talk about this for a minute. I'm not going to cut him down. I'm not going to go over here and try to pit us against one another, because all that does is play right into the hands of Donald Trump. So if a certain social media influencer isn't your cup of tea, find the one that is. Find the one that is. I've had people say to me, I didn't really care for that guest you had on. Well, okay, fine. You didn't have to. I didn't say you had to love them. But I thought that it was important we sat down and talk and lift them up. I thought it was important that we lifted up their voice, because you know what? They had a crowd too. Now I know I'm closing down on 500,000 subscribers. I've went on podcasts that had less than 1,000, and I've sat down and talked with them. Why? Because they had 1,000 people that I probably didn't have. There's a good chance I didn't have those people. They were reaching people. So now they hear me, and now my audience hears them, and everybody benefits. So it's a matter of lifting one another up right now and not trying to come at each other's throat. It's not accomplishing anything. It's never going to accomplish anything other than more lost elections. That's why we lose. We lose when we don't stand together. I can already hear somebody saying, well, that's cultish. I don't want to be in a cult. It's not cultish. Cultish is going out and putting a guy's head on Rambo's body and flying the flag off your truck. Cultish is giving that guy a pass for every single thing that he does. That's not what I'm saying we do. What I'm saying we do is that we work on our own problems, but we realize that we are for the greater good, and therefore we're going to stay united and we're going to vote together. It's important that we vote and come together on the same side. And we can split those hairs later. But because we have to have reasonable people. How many of you out there, you may not be agreeing with everything I say, but how many of you out there will at least admit that Kamala Harris would have been someone that we could have reasoned with? Come January 20th, we're not going to have anyone in power that we can reason with. So to sit and cut each other down and try to destroy each other is absolutely counterproductive. It destroys the whole thing. I may not agree with everything I hear someone say. I may not agree, or I may not like their tone, or I may not like the way they go about it, but it's a matter of realizing they've got the same common interest as me, and our common interest is much better and means more to the country than the cruelty and the hatred that is MAGA. As long as we stay divided, they're going to keep on winning. So something to think about. I know not everyone's going to agree with me, and I know people are still going to continue to yell at one another. But that's not what I plan to do going forward. I plan to circle and work to build this circle outward and make these independent journalists mean something and make their voices matter and get them out there to bigger audiences and bigger platforms, because we all need to be on the ground talking about these issues. And I appreciate you guys for sitting here with me. I know you guys don't agree with everything I say. You message and tell me. But I don't get on here and cut you down. I don't get on here and read your message and mock and make fun of you. That's not what we should ever be. We should be about doing better. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. And thanks for listening.